So it's always nice to be in front of a hometown audience. First of all, I don't get the 3 questions that I always get when I'm outside of Texas and speaking. The first question I always get is, where's your accent? And the answer to that is my mom was an English teacher, so there's a reason why I didn't have an accent. And then they're like, why aren't you wearing cowboy boots? Like, well, we don't wear cowboy boots all the time. And then when they find out that I grew up on a ranch out in East Texas, they said, well, did you take a horse to school? I was like, no, I didn't take a horse to school. I took a yellow school bus like everybody else. But it is always fun to be here, and I really appreciate the Federal Reserve for inviting me, Citi for sponsoring, Dallas Social Venture Partners for being conspirators in this event. And truly, I wanted to kind of expose you to something a little bit different than what the other speakers are going to be exposing you to. One of the things that I'm passionate about is the fact that we need to create greater social change in society. And we'll talk a little bit about where that passion comes from. But what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about how we can create that change. And you're going to be hearing a lot of great speakers who are going to be talking about what I call verticals. So that's consultant speak for issue areas, so education, poverty, etc. But one of the things we don't spend as much time on is the horizontals. How do we actually create this large-scale change? How do we do good better? How do we actually create the change that we want to create? And so what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about is kind of a philosophy of social entrepreneurship. And truthfully, as I have studied this, I really do think, and I think is evidenced by the book What Works, we do know the vast majority of how to solve some of our social issues. And that may be a surprise to so many of you. But the truth is, we know what works. So what is getting in our way? Well, unfortunately, the bad news is the enemy is us. And oftentimes we aren't thinking about how to accelerate social change. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think social change can change, as well as how you can be a social game changer yourself. So this is me. And I'll tell you right now, no animals were harmed by taking of this picture. And you can see I was a social activist at a very young age. And so I tell everybody, and my parents will tell people this too, that I come by it honestly. So my mom was a social worker, my dad was an educator, so we actually grew up talking around the dinner table about social issues. In fact, if we weren't well educated enough on a social issue, we would actually have to go back and read the newspaper to find out more about the social issue. And truthfully, they did a lot to really teach me about how hard it is to go into poverty-stricken communities in schools and really make a big difference. In fact, a little known fact, we never had a mailbox when I was growing up because every single time it got plowed down. Because we'd go into places where they were really trying to create change in those schools or in those communities. And so, of course, the frisky teenagers thought it would be fun to go mow down the principal's mailbox. So there was a lot of things that we did. Eventually, my dad ran for county commissioner. And so there was kind of 2 things to know about me. One, I love solving puzzles. And so that actually is a lot of how I've approached social issues. And 2, I love politics. In fact, when I was in the 6th grade, the paper that I wrote was when my friends were writing about elephants versus rhinoceroses, I was actually talking about the difference between Republicans and Democrats. So for those of you who know me, that's probably not a big surprise. And so truly, social change was a part of who I was. And actually, it was just part of my DNA. So I moved on, and when I actually became, after I graduated from UT Austin, I actually went to go work in the social space. The 2 organizations I went to go work for was Phoenix House and the American Heart Association. I was working in the regional office of Phoenix House, the national office of the Heart Association, which is here in Dallas. And when I was at Phoenix House, one of the things that really struck me as someone who liked to solve problems is at that time in the 90s, we actually didn't really talk about addiction. We didn't want to talk about addiction. In fact, if you were a teenager that was caught with a substance, you actually had to go to jail to get treatment. I'm pleased to say today, through the work of Phoenix House and through the problem solving that we did, there actually are residential treatment facilities that are actually diversion from jail. And interestingly enough, Phoenix House, one of the things it taught me was really around the ability to create change. And also the ability of the Dallas community to import good solutions, because actually, interestingly enough, Phoenix House actually came from New York City. And so that was my first experience with New Yorkers. And so there are some really great things that we can import from across the country. Moving forward, I then went to work for the American Heart Association, and at the American Heart Association, one of the things that I was transfixed by was really the change that we were making between being a program-oriented culture in the social space to actually taking on new and evolving ways of creating social change. I'll give you a really good example. So we could go school to school, child to child, parent to parent, and try to get them to not use tobacco products, or try to get them to be more physically active. But we could change one policy in one state and create large-scale change. In fact, I remember being really struck when a statistician at the Heart Association told me that this generation of students, the one that's in high school right now, would be the first generation that would not outlive their parents. And of course, the problem solver in me said, we can't have that happen. We've got to do more to actually create change. And so what happened, and this was really a crucible for a lot of the change in my own life, is two men walked into my life at that point, and actually really got me thinking about how we needed to do social issues differently. One was former President Bill Clinton, and when he actually took on the issue of childhood obesity, I spent half of my time in New York City and half my time in Dallas working on trying to push the issue forward. And the thing that he taught me was to always think big. When I was telling him that probably one of the biggest problems we had was soft drinks actually in schools and kind of what the school menu was like, we were talking at a small level, going school by school, going state by state. And he said, let's just get the manufacturers together and convince them that we should just take sugar drinks out of all schools. And indeed, that's what we did. And you can see that it actually has created a large change. In fact, the recent reports show that childhood obesity is actually on the decline. And then on from there. The second man that actually really influenced me quite significantly at that time was a gentleman named Greg Dees, and he's the father of social entrepreneurship, which is what we're talking about today. And one of the things that I was increasingly interested in is how we were going to create this large-scale change, how we would have to do our jobs differently in order to create the change that we needed to create. And as the father of social entrepreneurship, he was the one that really helped drive that notion forward, that we really needed to think differently about social issues. So as I evolved, I realized that the nonprofit sector was in a shift period. We were at a pivot point. And actually, we were shifting from the 20th century to the 21st century at the same time. And from doing that, we recognized that as a sector, we needed to change. The rules needed to change. Again, we were focused so much on the verticals and not enough on the horizontal, on how we were going to get the large-scale change. So I want to kind of describe to you a couple of the things that I think are really important in creating that change as a lens for you to look at the rest of the day. So we are living in exponential times. I could do a dissertation on all the things that we have done that has been really great in society. But if you look at our record right now, the war on poverty, the civil rights movement, all of the things that are close to my heart, you realize we haven't made the large-scale change that we wish to make. While the poverty gap between blacks and whites has actually come together and is not quite as significant, the employment rate is still not changed as far as unemployment between the two. There's more that needs to be done in this area. So as you look at this, I do think we need new tools. We need new rules to really figure out a way to really do create that exponential change over time. So as I mentioned earlier, I love solving problems. Another thing to know about my family is we played games every single weekend. In fact, my parents had a ban on electronic toys, which is actually kind of interesting given if you think about it in current times. I don't know how my nephews would get along without having their electronic toys, but we played games. And so what I thought we would do to kind of talk about some of the ideas is through the lens of these various games. So one of the areas that I feel really strongly about, and you're going to be hearing about today, is kind of the difference between innovation and impact. And it's really not an either-or choice. I'm a big believer that it's not an either-or world, it's a both-and world. But the reality is we do spend so much time reinventing the wheel in the social space. And this book is evidence of the fact there are so many things we already know that we just need to apply. Or if we are going to be innovative, we need to do adaptive innovation, where we're taking the best that is existing and building upon it. And truthfully, the new bottom line of the social sector is impact. And that's really where we all need to be getting towards. How are we creating that impact is the new bottom line. And then from there, how are we creating scale? And I think the book does a fabulous job of actually talking through this. And that impact and scale is really where we're going to be taking the social space more in the future. So the game of Monopoly. Another thing that I think we're seeing is a trend that is actually changing is it used to be that nonprofits had the monopoly on the social space. But now we're seeing for-profit investors getting into the social space and coming up with ed tech software. We're seeing companies who are involved in CSR initiatives that are moving forward the social space at an exponential rate. We're seeing foundations doing strategic philanthropy and getting in the middle of doing work themselves. United Way doing the work themselves. Here in Dallas, Destination Graduation is a good example of that. So no longer do nonprofits have a monopoly on creating social change. And in my mind, I think this is actually a really good thing. I really believe we need an all-in mentality if we're going to win against some of the big social issues that we're engaged in. But as you can imagine, if we're going to actually make that change, we've got to stop thinking about ourselves as nonprofits and more about thinking about us as change agents. How do we actually create change? In fact, I oftentimes tell my clients, think less about being a service provider and think more about being a solution provider. What solution are you bringing to the table now? And that solution doesn't have to be a program anymore. It can be advocacy, it can be collaboration, it can be a lot of different things. So the form can be very different in the new age. Another one is we actually are seeing a great influx of really great talent into the social space, but unfortunately they're ill prepared for all the things that are happening. People think that being in the nonprofit space is easy. In fact, a lot of people think it's very easy, but it's actually very hard to try to balance all the things that need to happen in order to make a nonprofit or a social change initiative successful. And so from a career perspective, I think what you're seeing is you're seeing people who have passion, who are going into the space, but the new professional in the social space not only has to have that passion, but has to have the passion and the discipline. And when I say discipline, I mean business acumen. The ability to look at a market, the ability to look at the competition, the ability to drive a business model that is going to be sustainable. So it's one thing for us to come up with social initiatives, but it's a whole nother thing to not make them dependent upon philanthropic dollars, donor dollars, and really looking forward to the sustainability of that organization. So with this influx of millennials, some of which I teach at University of North Texas, who would love to be in the social space and really want to make a difference, to the baby boomers who are really wanting to come up with a way to create a difference now that they're on their second career, we have a lot of possibility in this area. And it's really going to be up to us as a community to figure out how do we create those on-ramps for those people to make sure that they, one, come into the space, and then they stay in the space, and then they're satisfied with the space. Another area that I think is important is the area of risk. Interestingly enough, there is another F word in the nonprofit space, not the one you're thinking of, by the way, and that word is failure. We don't talk about failure in the social space, and it's really interesting as somebody who's gotten an MBA and we're in the business space where you talk about failure all the time as a way towards learning. Failure is incredibly important for us as a sector to get comfortable with. And if it's following the lead of a United Way lead person in Cincinnati who calls failures fabulous failures, or when I was at the Heart Association and when a failure happened, we called it a skip in the CD, or whatever it is, we've got to figure out a way to get comfortable with failure. It is through that failure that we create learning and we create growth. And we make sure that the people who are moving beyond us and creating change aren't creating those same failures and those same mistakes. So we have to start getting comfortable with that. We also have to start getting comfortable with risk. And I'll give you a really good example of that. One of the people who I think is really a leading social entrepreneur who has actually come from the tech space is Bill Gates. And people talk all the time about how great he is. But let me tell you the two things I think that he's done that probably give the best example of his greatness. Number one, when he decided he was going to solve for malaria, notice he didn't say reduce malaria. He wanted to solve for malaria. He decided to go after 3 different ventures because he figured that the reward of actually one of them being successful was much more likely. And he didn't look at 3 nonprofits. He looked at 3 solutions, and then really their legal designation mattered very little to him. And the other thing he did is he actually created the Gates Foundation to not last in perpetuity. So they're putting an all-in mentality. They're putting all their money towards creating social change. And so actually it won't exist after either Bill Gates or his wife pass away, because they're putting all their money to trying to solve malaria. And it really is going to take those type of risk takers, both in the philanthropic space, the nonprofit space, and the social entrepreneurs, to really start solving some of the issues that we need to solve. And this is probably one of my favorites. Not only was it my favorite game as a kid with Candyland, but the other thing I think we've got to be careful about, and this is certainly something that that is one of the things I love about being in Dallas is the concept of niceness versus progress. And many of you maybe have heard me talk about this. This has been my thing for 2014. The reality is we're very nice in this space. We are very nice. It's one of the reasons why I love working with my clients, is because the first thing they ask me is not where is the deliverable, but how was your weekend? And that doesn't always happen. And I love my clients. But the reality is we sometimes have to put our niceness aside and say we're going to make progress. And that means we've got to be able to take on failure. We've got to constructively critique each other and not take this business personally. This is, at the end of the day, about creating social change. So I would really encourage you, as you kind of go out there, to really kind of have that mantra of niceness versus progress. So last but not least, you're probably thinking about what are the new rules of the game. So truly, I think if you look at this, you probably think that's not very different than a for-profit model. The only difference is you have the impact part wedged in. We really are going to have to think about social change as a business done in the social space. How do we create sustainable social good? And it really is two sides of a coin, looking at high impact and really creating that impact and scale, but also at the same time creating really well-performing organizations, ones that have the appropriate resources, ones that have the appropriate capital to make change. So those are the new rules. So lastly, the new people. I actually really believe, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, that in order for us to create the social change, you can't just expect nonprofits are going to go out and solve the problem, or social entrepreneurs. It has to be an all-in game for us to win. And that means all of you here. And I want you to think about all the roles that you play that can actually move us forward. One, you're a purchaser of social goods. So when you choose a caterer, choose someone that's actually employing young people, one like Cafe Momentum here locally. You're an investor. Look at your stock portfolio and your retirement. Are you investing in socially conscious funds? Are you investing in great things like Michelle is going to be talking about that actually are creating a return, but also creating social good? Are you on a board of a nonprofit? And when you're on a board, do you check your hat when you walk in, or do you ask the difficult questions, which is incredibly important? If you're an employer, you may want to actually give time off for volunteer activity and pro bono work. If you look at the new millennials, actually the new millennials are looking for companies that really want to create social change and not just a bottom line. And so there's all sorts of ways that you can be involved as a voter, as an influencer, et cetera. So from my perspective, if we're going to win the game, if we're going to really basically change the way we've actually solved social good, we've actually got to have an all-in mentality. So I hope you guys will leave here, not only because of the great content you're going to receive on the verticals, but really see yourself as part of the solution. Thank you very much.